My name is Rosalind Mayer. For 20 years, I played the role of a well-dressed illusion. My home was polished, my husband polite, our routines practiced like a dance, choreographed to perfection. But beneath all that choreography was silence, deafening, aching silence, the kind that seeps under doors and clings to your bones. People envied us. You and Alan are just so composed, they'd say. Composed? That was always the word. I suppose it was true. I was composed like a statue in a museum, admired, untouchable, cold. Alan and I met at a university alumni event in Philadelphia. I was teaching etiquette and public presentation at a finishing school back then, and he was already a rising executive at a pharmaceutical firm. He had a strong jawline, an expensive watch, and a voice that made people lean in. I mistook those things for love. He was never cruel, never violent, just distant. We didn't kiss like lovers. We didn't argue like partners. We were like well-placed furniture, useful, well-kept, and expected to stay exactly where we were placed. There were no children. That was never a conversation, it just didn't happen. And when I tried to bring it up in my late 40s, he said, "We're enough for each other, Roz." He smiled when he said it, poured me a glass of wine, and changed the subject to a museum exhibit opening. I let it go. That's what I did back then. I let things go. And yet, something inside me always felt hollow. I'd sit at dinner parties surrounded by laughter and chatter and feel like a ghost at my own table. Even the way Alan looked at me, it was as if he was seeing a reflection of himself, not a woman he loved. I wasn't his wife. I was a part of his image. But still, I didn't ask, because I didn't want to hear the answers. I told myself that maybe this was just what marriage looked like after 20 years. That maybe love didn't always feel warm. Then Thomas died. Thomas was Alan's best friend, or so I thought. They'd met in college, traveled together, shared inside jokes I was never part of. He was a professor of literature, witty and sarcastic, with a laugh that made wine glasses shake. I liked him. In fact, sometimes I felt like he saw me more clearly than Alan ever did. When Thomas got sick, Alan was inconsolable. He visited him at the hospice every single day for weeks. Canceled meetings, missed a promotion, slept on the guest room couch with the door closed. I thought it was grief. Male friendship, I reasoned, ran deeper than I understood. The night Thomas passed, Alan didn't come home. I called him. No answer. He showed up the next morning at 6 a.m., wearing the same clothes from the day before, eyes red and jaw clenched. He smelled like scotch and gardenia. His suit jacket was wrinkled, and there was a long pink thread on his sleeve, something soft like silk. I just needed time, he said. He was important. Important. I nodded. I didn't ask why he hadn't called. I didn't ask why he cried like a widow. But something in my stomach turned that morning. Not jealousy, not grief, just the cracking of a glass you didn't know was under pressure. That week I started noticing things, not big things, subtle shifts like static behind the smile. Alan grew quieter, jittery. His phone buzzed more. He locked his study. I'd never thought to check his drawers before. But one morning, while dusting the bookshelf, I saw it. A small brass key tucked behind a hardcover edition of The Picture of Dorian Gray. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't gasp or drop anything. I simply slipped the key into my apron pocket and went about my morning like a woman folding a stranger's laundry. That evening, after Alan left for a walk, I used it. The drawer was in his study desk. It opened stiffly. Inside, one small wooden box polished and lined with navy velvet. My breath caught. Photos. Dozens of them. Alan and Thomas at the beach, arms around each other. At a masquerade, holding hands. A selfie shirtless in a hotel bed. 2 wedding bands on a table beside untouched champagne. A postcard that read, "One day the world won't need to know, but I'll always know. Yours, T." I dropped the box. Silence exploded in my ears like a bomb. My hand trembled as I put everything back in place. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I locked the drawer, wiped my fingerprints off the key, and walked out of the study like a guest who had seen too much. I spent the next hour sitting on the edge of our bathtub, staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror. I didn't recognize her. She looked like someone who had lived her whole life underwater Elegant, preserved, emotionally drowned. When Alan came home that night, he kissed my cheek. And I smiled like nothing had shattered. I didn't speak of it. Not that night. Not the next. The silence became my accomplice. It wasn't fear that kept me from confronting Alan. It was curiosity. I needed to know how long had I been playing a role in a script I didn't write. So I watched. I became a quiet observer of my own life, as if watching a play from behind the curtain. Alan went about his days like nothing had changed. But I noticed everything now. The subtle shift in his shoulders when I asked about Thomas. The tremble in his fingers when he poured wine. The way he never touched me hadn't touched me in years, but now it felt almost repulsed. That repulsion wasn't mine. It was his. The next weekend, I found a hotel receipt in the laundry folded neatly in the pocket of his slacks. Not recent. Dated 3 years ago. A boutique hotel in New York City. 2 nights. King suite. Paid in cash. I remembered that weekend I'd gone to visit my sister in Vermont. He said he had business meetings. I'd believed him. I always did. But now a different image replaced those memories. I could almost see them, Alan and Thomas, in that hotel suite, living the life they denied in daylight. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was embarrassed. Embarrassed that I had spent decades setting the table, folding his clothes, perfecting every dinner party. For a man who only ever saw me as camouflage. A woman shaped like a lie. I started pulling threads. There were more receipts, concerts. I wasn't invited to gifts. I never received dinner reservations under different names. I found a second phone, hidden in the back of a filing cabinet between old tax folders and warranty papers. It had no passcode. The messages were still there, short, cryptic, but unmistakable. Thomas, I wish you could sleep beside me without guilt. Alan, 1 more year. I promise. Thomas, you've been promising that for 19? 19. I did the math. That meant their affair, or whatever you'd call, something that consumed and twisted 2 people, had begun a year after our wedding. I stared at those texts until the screen dimmed, until the words lost shape, until my tears finally came, not the violent kind. Just quiet, long, heavy. I cried like I was leaking a truth I didn't know I'd carried. That night, Alan came home late again. His eyes looked sunken, face unshaven blazer tossed carelessly over the armchair. He poured himself whiskey, and I watched him from the hallway. And then I asked, "Did you love him?" The glass froze at his lips. His shoulders tightened. Slowly he lowered it, but didn't look at me. His voice when it came was low. "What are you talking about?" I stepped forward. My hands were calm, my voice colder than I intended. "Thomas, did you love him?" He finally looked at me, and I saw it. The panic, the sorrow, the grief, the guilt. All at once. "Yes," he whispered. There it was. The truth, as naked and unshakable as bone. He sat down, rubbed his hands together. "I never meant to hurt you." A laugh escaped my throat. "But you did. Every day." He looked up. "You were happy." "No," I said. I was quiet. He buried his face in his hands. Then the gaslighting began. "You wouldn't have understood. The world was different back then. I couldn't be that man. Not in my job. Not with my family. You wouldn't have stayed if I told you." And yet I replied, "You stayed. You stayed and used me." He shot up. "I didn't use you. You wore me like a ring," I snapped. "Convenient. Respectable. Empty." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just sat back down, picked up his glass, and finished it in one gulp. I didn't sleep in our bedroom that night. I took the guest room, the one he used when Thomas was dying. And when I turned off the light, I stared at the ceiling and thought, I am a woman who lost her husband not to death, but to a truth too cowardly to face her. The next morning, he made eggs. He said nothing. Neither did I. It was war by silence. The eggs were overcooked. It was a small thing, burnt edges, too much pepper, but somehow it felt symbolic. A marriage 20 years in the making reduced to a plate of dry eggs and silence. We sat across from each other at the kitchen island, the morning sun pouring in as if nothing was broken, as if I hadn't uncovered an entire life that ran parallel to mine. Alan chewed slowly, avoided my eyes. He didn't ask how I slept. I didn't ask where he'd been. We were strangers wearing wedding rings. I stared at my plate. I couldn't bring myself to touch the food. My hands rested still on the marble counter as if movement might shatter the fragile peace between us. After breakfast, he slipped on his coat and muttered something about a meeting. I watched him walk out the door. Then I reached for the manila folder I'd started filling. Receipts, printouts, messages, copies of everything I'd found. I wasn't entirely sure what I was building, only that it needed to exist. Proof for whom I didn't know. Maybe for me, maybe for the version of myself that still couldn't believe I'd been nothing more than an accessory in my own life. That afternoon, I called Dr. Winters, my former colleague from the Etiquette Academy, now a licensed therapist. She had once told me over wine that beneath every elegant woman was a wounded girl who'd simply learned how to carry the pain with posture. I didn't know what I would say, but I needed to say something. Her voice was warm. "Rosalind," she said, "I'm so glad you called." I didn't cry. Not at first. I just told her what had happened. The box, the photos, the texts, his confession. Then her silence cracked something open in me. And suddenly, I was sobbing into the phone, gasping between words as if saying them made the betrayal real. She didn't interrupt. When I quieted, she simply said, "You were his beard, Rosalind." It was a brutal sentence, a truth shaped like a slap. I'd heard the term before, women used as a front to conceal a gay partner's identity. It had always seemed like a tragic footnote in someone else's story. Now it was mine. She continued gently. "It's not just about his sexuality. It's about the years he took from you. The emotional labor, the gaslighting, the way he let you believe in a fantasy because it was easier than being honest." I whispered, "I don't know who I am without him." She paused. "You're not without him. You never had him." The room spun slightly. "I'll see you next week," she said. "If you're ready." I was. That night, Alan didn't come home. I didn't text. I didn't call. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in his study. I opened the drawer again, not for the photos this time, but for something else. I found a handwritten letter tucked beneath the velvet lining. Dated 6 years ago, addressed to no one. "I can't keep doing this. I'm tired of pretending. Every night beside her feels like lying to the moon. But I'm also tired of hiding from the world. Thomas says I need to choose. But how do I unbuild a life I never meant to build?" He hadn't sent it. Maybe he never meant to. But reading it made something inside me settle. Not peace, no, not that, but clarity. This was never about me not being enough. It was about him never being whole. And while that might explain the hurt, it didn't excuse the harm. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase. I didn't tell Alan. I didn't leave a note. I drove to the coast, booked a weekend in a cottage overlooking the bay. I turned off my phone. And for the first time in years, I heard nothing but waves and my own breath. I walked barefoot on cold sand, drank tea by the window, read The Awakening by Kate Chopin, and every evening I wrote in my journal. The first page simply said, "He lived a lie, and I lived inside it." I didn't know what my revenge would look like. Not yet. But I knew one thing. It wouldn't be loud. It would be elegant. And it would be mine. The cottage by the bay became my sanctuary. 3 days turned into 5. I didn't rush to leave. Alan sent a few texts. "Where are you? Are you okay? Please call me," but I didn't respond. I let the silence answer for me. I needed space to think. Not just about him. About me. About the version of Rosalind I might finally become now that the performance was over. On the 6th day, I drove home. It was early evening when I pulled into the driveway. The porch light was on. The house looked unchanged, but I wasn't. Inside, I found Alan asleep on the couch, still in work clothes, one shoe off, one on. There were takeout boxes stacked on the kitchen counter. He looked smaller somehow, faded. I didn't wake him. Instead, I went straight to the guest room and locked the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of Thomas. But not as I remembered him, laughing at dinner parties or swirling wine with his ridiculous pinky lift. In the dream, he stood across from me in a field of tall grass. He didn't speak. He just looked at me with an expression I couldn't name. Was it regret? Pity? Gratitude? I woke up before I could ask. The next morning, I stood in front of the closet I hadn't opened in months. Alan's storage cabinet. Not his suits, the other one. The one with keepsakes, travel mementos, college albums. He never let me organize it. Always said it was sentimental junk. I opened it. There were photo albums, yellowed journals, theater stubs from the 90s, and a box labeled Nantucket him. I knew the handwriting, it wasn't Alan's. Inside, postcards matching rings, a faded Polaroid of the two of them on a sailboat, bare-chested arms wrapped around each other. On the back it read, "You said we'd grow old by the sea, so where are we now?" I sat on the floor and let the past flood in. He had loved Thomas. Desperately, maybe even faithfully in his own compartmentalized way, but he had loved him in secret, at my expense. While I made turkey at Thanksgiving and ironed napkins for holiday dinners, while I curled my hair and smiled for family photos, while I waited in bed with a book that never got read, he never chose me. He used me to hide. That realization didn't burn, it numbed. Later that week, Alan asked if we could talk. We sat in the sunroom. He poured tea, but neither of us touched it. "I was going to tell you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "After Thomas passed, I couldn't lie anymore." "But you did," I said softly. He nodded, ashamed. "Was it always him?" He didn't answer right away. Then, there were others. But Thomas was real. I looked out the window. "What do you want from me, Alan?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, "I don't know. Forgiveness. Understanding." I shook my head. "You don't get to ask for both." He stared at me. "You were always so graceful, Roz. I thought you'd take this with composure." And there it was. The word again. Composure. That had always been the expectation. Be poised. Be pleasant. Be palatable. But I was done performing. I stood. "I'm going out," I said. "Don't wait up." I didn't tell him where. I drove to Thomas's memorial site. It was a simple marble plaque near the botanical garden where he used to give readings. Flowers were still fresh. Someone had left a rainbow pin nestled among lavender stems. I sat beside it for hours. As dusk fell, a woman approached. Mid-50s. Blonde, streaked with silver. A long navy coat. She looked at me. "You're Rosalind, aren't you?" My heart stopped. "I am." She sat. "I'm Marlene. Thomas and we were friends. I've heard about you." I didn't ask what she'd heard. I didn't need to. She glanced at the flowers. "He loved Alan, but he always said he felt like a ghost." My throat tightened. "So did I." She looked at me then, deep, understanding eyes. "I think," she said gently, "we both married the same man, just in different rooms of the same house." I let that settle. 2 women, 1 truth. A shared betrayal woven into different fabrics. We didn't speak after that. Just sat. Let the silence say what words could not. When I drove home, the porch light was still on. But I didn't go inside. I sat in the car for an hour, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine, feeling the shift inside me harden into something else. I wasn't done grieving, but I was done pretending. The next morning, I moved into the guest room permanently. No announcement, no explanation. Just a quiet shifting of hangers, toiletries, and silence. Alan noticed, of course, but he didn't stop me. Instead, he hovered in doorways, hovered during breakfast, hovered like a man waiting for a sentence he hadn't read, but knew was coming. He brought me flowers, lilies. My least favorite, though. I'd never told him that. Funny how a man can live with you for 20 years and still not know what scents make you recoil. One evening, he knocked on the guest room door. "Rosalind," he said, voice low. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer right away. Then, "If you're ready to tell the truth. All of it." He stepped inside slowly like a man entering his own trial. "I want to start with this," he said, pulling a folded letter from his blazer. "Thomas wrote this. For you. He asked me to give it to you. Years ago. But I didn't." I took the letter with steady hands. He left the room before I could open it. The envelope was ivory hand-addressed in Thomas's sweeping script. The seal was unbroken. Inside, 3 pages, ink slightly faded. No greeting, just a date 7 years ago. "Rosalind, you don't know me the way I know you, but I've watched you quietly for years. And what I see is grace, dignity, a woman who deserved far more truth than she was ever given. I don't blame you for hating me. I've been where you are, on the outside of a truth, Someone else keeps locked. Alan and I. We were never just friends, but we were also never free. That's the tragedy. He loved you in a way, not the way you deserved, but in the only way he knew. I told him once that living two lives meant you lost both. I hope someday you'll forgive him. Not for his sake, but for yours. No woman should be buried under someone else's shame. Be free, Rosalind. Not graceful, not composed. Free. I read it 3 times, each time slower than the last. And I cried not for Alan, not even for myself. I cried for Thomas, for a man who lived half a love story in stolen shadows. For a man who, despite everything, had the courage to write what Alan never could. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I walked the house. I walked past the rooms where I had smiled for guests, hosted holiday dinners, taught neighborhood girls how to set a formal table. Rooms where I had arranged flowers, adjusted curtains, straightened Alan's tie. Rooms where I had disappeared gracefully, of course. In the study, I found Alan asleep in the armchair, head tilted back, glasses slipping down his nose. The television hummed a documentary neither of us had watched. I looked at him, not with hate, not with love, with finality. The next day, I booked a consultation with a divorce attorney. Her office smelled like lemon-scented polish and silent resolve. She wore a crisp blazer and nodded thoughtfully as I explained my situation. I have no proof of abuse, I said. Just deception. She smiled gently. Rosalind, deception is abuse. It's just in a nicer suit. That line stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I gathered paperwork, financial statements, property records, copies of messages, letters. Alan didn't fight me. Not yet. Maybe he thought I was bluffing. Maybe he thought I'd calm down. He underestimated what silence can teach a woman. Because in that silence, I had found something stronger than rage. Clarity. I didn't want to punish him for being gay. I wanted to hold him accountable for stealing my life to hide his. The day I handed him the divorce papers, I made steak. His favorite, with rosemary potatoes and wine. I wore the navy dress he'd always liked. Pearls. Hair done. He came home and blinked in surprise at the table set for 2. Special occasion? He asked. I handed him the manila envelope across the linen napkin. His hands froze. He opened it. Read the first page. His eyes didn't lift. I see, he said. No, Alan, I replied softly. You never did. He looked up then. So this is it. It was over the moment you used me to disappear. He swallowed. You'll ruin me. No, I said, standing. You ruined yourself. And I walked away. I didn't cry. Not that night. Not anymore. Divorce was not a battlefield. It was a quiet negotiation with ghosts. There were no screaming matches, no smashed plates, no melodrama. Just long meetings, cold coffee, and the slow, methodical unweaving of 20 years of shared bills and unshared truths. Alan didn't contest the filing. I suspect part of him was relieved. The public narrative was that we had grown apart. Mutual decision, amicable separation, a graceful exit. That was the lie we told the world. But the truth was a chasm between us, deep, cold, and hollowed out by years of silence. The only real fight we had during the entire process was over the house. He wanted to keep it, said it was his childhood home, said his parents' ashes were in the garden, said I could take the beach house instead. I laughed, not a kind laugh, a bitter, breathless one. You want the house you built your lie in? I asked. Be my guest. I signed it over that day, not out of surrender but strategy. Let him have the stage where he performed. I was done being the prop. I took the beach house, the stocks he thought I didn't know about, and the savings account hidden under the name E.L. Trust. Turns out Thomas's middle name was Edward. That detail stung more than it should have. My lawyer Brenda was brilliant. The kind of woman who wore red lipstick like armor and didn't flinch when men tried to condescend. After reviewing our final asset division, she leaned back and said, He got the house. You got your name back. That felt true in a way no document could express. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Alan sent me an email. It was short. I hope one day you'll find peace. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't reply. Instead, I went to the beach. It was early morning, the sky still bruised with dawn. I sat on the porch with tea watching waves erase footprints I hadn't made yet. For the first time in decades, I didn't have a schedule. No dinners to host. No linens to starch. No lies to live inside. Just the sound of the sea and the creaking of my own bones as they settled into a new rhythm. A few days later, I opened a storage box I'd brought from the old house. Inside were journals from my 20s, a vintage camera, and an old cassette tape labeled Roz, 1992. It was a voice recording me coaching a group of women on public speaking. My voice was so young, so confident, so unburdened. I had forgotten that version of myself existed. I played it 3 times. Then I made a decision. I called Dr. Winters, my therapist, and told her I wanted to start something new. Not just therapy, a movement. Something for women like me, women who had been used, silenced, or erased in someone else's story. We brainstormed over tea. A week later, I filed paperwork for a nonprofit. The Second Self. It would offer workshops, support groups, and legal aid for women exiting emotionally deceptive marriages, particularly those where sexuality and shame were weaponized. I didn't want to punish Alan anymore. I wanted to dismantle the system that allowed him to hide behind me in the first place. I didn't tell him about it. He'd see it in the papers soon enough. One afternoon, as I was sorting through branding ideas, I came across a note from Thomas, one I had somehow missed. It was tucked behind an old poetry book handwritten on thick stationery. If love cannot be honest, it will always be cruel. But kindness is the revenge of the forgotten. I sat with that line for a long time. Kindness is the revenge of the forgotten. It echoed through me not as permission but as power. Because I had been forgotten. Overlooked. Used. But not anymore. Not now. I didn't need to expose Alan to the world. I just needed to become someone he could no longer reach. And that, more than any courtroom or confession, was the beginning of my freedom. Months passed and autumn came with its quiet gold. The beach house was smaller, simpler, but it was mine. The mornings smelled of sea salt and black coffee, and the walls echoed only my voice now. Not his footsteps, not his long sighs at the end of a lie-filled day. Just mine. I had begun writing again. Not diaries, not letters, essays, stories, lessons pulled from the dust of my former life. Every morning after yoga, yes, I started yoga. At 69, I'd sit by the window with a mug of ginger tea and write about the quiet betrayals women endure, about how the absence of touch can scream louder than words, about the cruelty of being someone's camouflage. The second self had grown faster than I imagined. A local news station did a spotlight. Then NPR called. Then women from all over the country began emailing. Some stories were eerily familiar. He never touched me, but never left either. I didn't realize I was the closet door. Everyone envied our marriage. I envied anyone who felt seen. He said I saved him. He forgot to ask who saved me. I replied to every email. Slowly, thoughtfully. It was the kind of work I'd waited my whole life to do, but didn't know I was allowed to. At one of the workshops, I met a woman named Gina, mid-40s, curly hair, eyes that had forgotten how to blink away tears. She spoke softly, but every sentence held a storm. Her husband had come out 2 years into their marriage, but he didn't leave. He stayed for their image, their families, their church. For 8 more years, she said he told me he was grateful. I was a good woman, like I was a vase. I nodded. I knew that feeling. Being appreciated like furniture. Gina looked at me and asked, "How do you forgive someone who used you to hate themselves less?" I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "You don't. You forgive yourself for not knowing. Then you forgive the years for passing. The rest, you outgrow." She cried. I held her hand. That night, after everyone left, I stood in the empty hall staring at the folding chairs and half-drunk paper cups of herbal tea. I felt a wave of gratitude for my anger. It had been the spark that led me here, but it was no longer the fire. Now it was purpose. On the 1-year anniversary of my divorce, I wrote Alan a letter. Not to send, just to write. "Alan, you wore me like a suit. Pressed proper, never quite fitting. You used my silence as permission, my grace as apology, my body as a locked door. But you were never mine, and I was never yours. Still I lived. I hosted. I aged. I wore pearls while you wore masks. But I'm free now. And I hope one day you find a mirror you're not afraid to look into. Rosalind. I folded the letter and burned it in the fireplace. Not out of rage. Out of ritual. A kind of sacred closure. Around that time, I heard through a mutual friend that Alan had been forced to take early retirement. The reason wasn't given, but I suspected the rumors, years of deception, buried scandals, whispers of what else has he hidden, had finally caught up with him. I didn't smile when I heard it. I didn't weep either. I felt nothing. And that perhaps was the most healing feeling of all. One chilly October morning, as I walked along the shoreline, I saw a young couple wrapped in a blanket, laughing, their foreheads touching. It was simple, honest, free. And for the first time in years, I didn't ache watching love. I just hoped they told each other the truth. The holidays came like a test. Thanksgiving invitations arrived mostly from distant relatives, who still didn't know the details of my divorce, just that Alan and Rosalind went their separate ways. I declined everyone. Instead, I cooked a modest dinner for myself in the beach house kitchen. Turkey breast, mashed parsnips, roasted carrots with thyme, one plate, one glass, one chair by the window where the sea kept me company. That night, I lit a single candle and made a quiet vow. I would never again set a table for someone who fed on my silence. I had spent years curating perfection, pressed linens, folded menus, matching wine glasses, all to mask a void I was too proud to name. Now I served myself, and it was enough. A few days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Handwritten. No return address. I opened it cautiously. Rosalind. I heard about the second self. I saw the segment on NPR. I'm proud of you. I know I don't have the right to say that, but I needed you to know. They offered me another position in Denver. I took it. A fresh start, I guess. Thank you for the years, even if I didn't deserve them. Take care of yourself. Alan. I read it twice. Then I folded it and placed it in the back of my filing cabinet between the tax returns and the title deed to the beach house. Not out of sentiment, just closure. Later that evening, I walked down to the shoreline, the sand cold beneath my boots, the wind tugging gently at my coat. I thought of all the women like me, women who had been used not in violence, but in convenience, who had given decades to someone else's denial, someone else's performance. There's a loneliness to that kind of betrayal. It's not explosive, it's eroding, like tidewater against stone. You don't notice what's missing until you realize you're hollowed out. That was when the idea came. A retreat. A weekend gathering for women like us. Not therapy. Not lectures. Just space. Candles. Journals. Shared meals. Fireside confessions under stars. I pitched it to the board of the Second Self the next week. They loved it. By spring, we had our first retreat in a converted farmhouse upstate. 25 women attended. Each of them brought a secret. Each of them left lighter. There was Marla, who'd been married to a preacher who condemned homosexuality in sermons while sleeping with men behind her back. There was Deborah, whose husband came out on Facebook before telling her, or their children. There was Linda, who had stayed married for the insurance. They laughed. They cried. They danced barefoot in the dewy grass. And for the first time, many of them told their stories out loud. One night, while we sat in a circle by the fire pit, a woman named Trisha asked, "Do you ever stop feeling foolish? Like you should have known." The group fell silent. I thought for a long time. Then I said, "We weren't foolish. We were loyal. There's a difference." They nodded. The fire crackled. Someone passed around a bottle of wine. In that moment, under stars and whispered pain, I realized something profound. I wasn't just healing. I was helping others see that their suffering wasn't their fault. And that in itself was revenge. Not on Alan, not on Thomas, not on the system that told women to smile through suspicion. It was revenge on shame, en silence, on the myth that composure is the same as peace. Before we left the retreat, I gave everyone a parting gift. A journal with one sentence etched on the inside cover. "Your life is not a cover story. Live like the headline." They cried. I did too. And when I returned to the beach house, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Whole. It was a Thursday afternoon in late spring when I received an email with the subject line, You don't know me, but I know your story. For a moment, my stomach knotted. Old reflexes, doubt, fear, suspicion rose like ghosts. But I clicked it open anyway. Dear Rosalind, I saw your talk at the retreat in Catskill. I wasn't brave enough to introduce myself, but I wanted to say thank you. I'm not a woman who was married to a closeted man. I am the man who kept a woman like you in a false story for years. Your words cut through me not because they were angry, but because they were true. I've started writing letters to my ex-wife. She doesn't respond. I don't blame her, but I keep writing them anyway because your story made me realize that silence isn't neutral. It's a prison. Thank you for being the mirror I couldn't avoid. Gratefully, M. I closed my laptop and stared out the window where the tide was rising. Not long ago, that kind of message would have made me recoil. Now it felt like something else. Proof that the ripples of truth do reach distant shores. I lit a candle and returned to my desk. I had a keynote speech to write. The second self had been invited to present at a national conference for women's justice in Washington, D.C. I would speak alongside activists, lawyers, survivors. But they wanted my voice not as a victim, but as a witness. The theme of the conference, uncovering the invisible wounds. So I wrote, I used to think the worst kind of betrayal was loud, obvious, violent. But the most dangerous betrayals wear suits, smile at dinner parties, hold your hand while hiding their heart in someone else's life. They thank you for being patient. They praise your grace. They say you saved them, but they never ask what it cost you. I stand here not to shame them, but to reclaim us. We are not side characters in someone else's secret. We are not props. We are not props. We are not props. We are the headline, and we are finally writing our own. I paused after that last line. My hands trembled. It was the first time in my life that my voice felt fully mine. 2 weeks later, I stood on a stage in a hotel ballroom, speaking those very words to an audience of nearly 600 people. They stood at the end, not for applause, for recognition. After the speech, a woman approached me in tears. She was in her 70s, impeccably dressed, clutching a delicate silk scarf between wrinkled fingers. I waited my whole life for someone to say that she said, and now I can say it too. We hugged like sisters who had finally found their shared last name. On the flight home, I didn't sleep. I looked out the window watching clouds fold and disappear beneath the wing. Somewhere below, Alan was probably still living in the same house with the same routines. I didn't know if he was out. I didn't know if he was happy. But I knew this. I no longer needed to wonder, because I was no longer living in his story. The next day, I found a package on my doorstep. Inside, a small frame with a pressed forget-me-not and a note from Gina, the woman I met at the first retreat. You reminded me I was more than the wife he never saw. I hung it by the front door, a quiet reminder that the work wasn't just a rebellion, it was a rescue. And every time I opened that door, I felt it again. I had walked out of a lie and into a life. Not long after the D.C. conference, a journalist reached out someone from a major women's publication. She wanted to feature the second self in a piece about women reclaiming their narratives after invisible betrayals. She asked for an interview. We met at a small cafe in Manhattan, the kind with copper lights and linen napkins folded like origami. I wore a cream blouse and my mother's brooch, armor of a different kind. The journalist Ava was in her 30s, sharp, soft-spoken, carried a notepad but listened more than she wrote. About halfway through, she asked, if you could say one thing to your younger self before the marriage, what would it be? I smiled without humor. You can't save someone from a truth they refuse to speak. She nodded, scribbled it down. Then after a pause, do you still think about him? I stirred my tea. Yes, but less like a wound and more like a scar. Something that no longer hurts, but still reminds me where I've been. The article was published a month later. The title was poetic and sharp. She was his alibi. Now she's her own liberation. It went viral. Thousands of women commented, shared, emailed. Some were still inside those marriages. Some had just escaped. Some had known the truth and buried it anyway. But all of them said the same thing. I thought I was the only one. That line echoed in my ears for days. Then came the invitation that changed everything. An international nonprofit Women Without Permission asked if I would speak at their global summit in Amsterdam. They were featuring architects of liberation, women who had not only survived their silencing, but had transformed it into something public, radical, and necessary. I said yes. I flew to Europe with 2 suitcases, 1 speech, and a heart that no longer apologized for its demands. The night before my talk, I walked along a canal under low lamps and cherry blossoms. Alone, free, no ring on my hand, no lie in my lungs. It began to drizzle. I didn't run for cover. Instead, I tilted my head back and let the rain fall. It wasn't cinematic. It was cold and real and cleansing. At the summit, my audience was a sea of women in hijabs, saris, pantsuits, and denim jackets. Survivors of betrayal in all its languages. I told them my story not to center Alan, but to center the silence he built, and the voice I rebuilt from its wreckage. My revenge wasn't cruel, I told them. It was quiet. It was mine. It was walking away with dignity and never offering an explanation. When I stepped off stage, a woman in her 60s wrapped me in an embrace and whispered, "He's still in my house. But after today, he's no longer in my head." That night, I sat in my hotel room and finally deleted Alan's number from my phone. It felt less like erasure and more like release. Back at the beach house, spring melted into summer. The tide came in earlier. The breeze smelled of salt and wild roses. The doorbell rang one morning. It was a courier. A legal envelope. Inside, notice that Alan had sold the old house. No note, no signature, just finality. I stood on the porch for a long while, envelope in hand, listening to the wind. That house had once been my prison of good manners and repressed questions. Now it belonged to someone else. Let them hang curtains over the ghosts. I walked down to the sand and stood barefoot at the edge of the surf. It curled around my ankles. I whispered something not to Alan, not to Thomas. To me. You made it out? Summer deepened. Mornings came earlier, like the sun was eager to reach me. I no longer kept a strict schedule. I let the sea decide the rhythm. Some days I wrote, some days I walked. Some days I simply was. Freedom isn't always a thunderclap. Sometimes it's the absence of apology. That was how I measured healing now. Not by how much I'd forgotten, but by how little I needed to explain. One Sunday, I received an invitation to a wedding. Gina, yes, the same. Gina from our first retreat was marrying a woman named Elise. The card was cream with gold script pressed flowers tucked inside. She had written in the margin, "I never thought love would look like this. Thank you for showing me it could." I cried when I read it. Happy tears. Proud tears. I attended the wedding with a shawl wrapped over my shoulders and a calm I hadn't known in decades. The ceremony was in a garden surrounded by climbing roses and laughter. When Gina walked down the aisle, she locked eyes with me for just a moment, and in that moment we both knew. This was reclamation. This was what truth looked like when it bloomed. At the reception, a woman named Martha approached me. Tall silver curls, eyes like frost. She gripped my hand and said, "Your story saved my daughter. She was about to marry someone who reminded me too much of your ex." We talked. She listened. She walked away. I stood there stunned. All I could manage was thank you. She smiled. "No, Rosalind. Thank you for bleeding out loud." That line stayed with me. When I returned home, I wrote a new essay. Bleeding Out Loud. Why quiet women are the ones you should listen to. It was published in The Atlantic. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in, not just from women, but from therapists, daughters, even a few brave men. One man wrote, "I didn't realize until I read your words that my mother was a silence in a dress. Thank you for giving her voice shape." That one broke me open. Because that's what silence is really, a shape. A room with no windows. A chair no one sits in. A woman smiling through a funeral that never ends. And that's what I had been, until now. Later that week, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and stared at my reflection. Not for vanity. For validation. Silver hair. Creased eyes. Steady hands. I looked older. Yes. But I also looked visible. Not decorative. Not polite. Present. I reached into the drawer and pulled out my old wedding ring. It had been sitting there for over a year. I took it outside to the rocks by the water and placed it in a seashell I found on the shore. Not buried, not thrown, just left. A monument, not a memory. As I stood up, I felt something shift. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a weight finally set down. That night, I made dinner for one. Played Debussy on the old radio. Lit a candle. Not because anyone was coming, but because I was worth the softness. When I went to bed, I whispered to the dark. You were a lesson. I am the rewrite. Autumn returned with its quiet gold and rust painting the coast in melancholy fire. It was my second year alone, but the first that didn't feel lonely. The beach house had become less of a refuge and more of a foundation. I'd hung art, bought real curtains, repainted the bedroom in a shade of blue that made me exhale every time I entered. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was mine. One Saturday, I hosted a small gathering of women from the second self. Just 10 of us. No speeches, no ceremony, just a fire pit, blankets, and soup warm enough to cut through anything the sea breeze carried in. We passed around stories like heirlooms. Some women whispered, others shouted. All of us, though, had that same look, one that only survivors wear. Not bitter, not broken, just awake. At some point during the evening, after the laughter had mellowed into the soft sound of spoons against bowls, Gina leaned toward me and asked, "Do you ever wish you'd known sooner?" I thought about it. Then I said, "Sometimes." But then I remember I might not have become this version of me without the breaking. Another woman, Eleanor, chimed in. "It's like those Japanese bowls, the ones repaired with gold." "Kintsugi," someone murmured. We sat in silence, letting the word fill the cracks. After everyone left, I walked the shoreline alone, barefoot despite the chill. The sand was cold, but the moonlight was generous, and I felt it again, that strange sense of being held by something bigger than the life I had lost. The next morning, I received a package. No return label. Inside, a thick book. Collected poems by Walt Whitman. A ribbon tucked into a page. It wasn't new. Worn, annotated, underlined. I flipped to the ribboned page and found this line. Do I contradict myself? Very well then. I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. Beneath the quote, a note in careful penmanship. I never knew how much of myself I denied until I saw you step into yours. I froze. Not Alan's handwriting. Thomas's. A chill ran down my spine. It had to be old, very old. Perhaps something he had prepared never mailed. Or maybe Alan had found it and quietly sent it now, too late and too heavy with meaning. I didn't know. And strangely, I didn't need to, because in that moment I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about all of us, Rosalind, Alan, Thomas, trapped in roles we didn't audition for. Held hostage by culture, by shame, by silence. Alan had performed a lie. Thomas had loved inside a closet. And I had hosted them both. But now, I hosted no one but myself. That night, I reread the poem aloud. My voice didn't waver. And when I looked up from the page, I saw my own reflection in the glass of the window. Silver hair, soft smile, eyes that held storms and stories. I whispered, "You contain multitudes too." Winter came like a hush. The beach turned gray and windswept waves crashing with a kind of primal clarity. I loved it even more this way. Raw, unapologetic, stripped of illusion. Nature had stopped pretending, and so had I. That season, the second self expanded beyond anything I had imagined. Chapters opened in Seattle, Chicago, Dublin. We partnered with mental health clinics, legal networks, even a theater group that staged dramatized monologues from anonymous letters we'd received. One night, I received a video from a performance in Toronto. A woman, mid-50s, tall, trembling but proud, stood beneath a spotlight and read from a script based on my first essay. I was not a wife. I was a silhouette in someone else's fairy tale. And when the lights came on, I wasn't angry. I was awake. The audience gave a standing ovation. I sat on my living room rug and cried. Not from sadness. From recognition. This was my life now. Not a revenge fantasy. Not a cautionary tale. A ripple. A reckoning. And in all of it, I was finally real. Then, one late January morning, a letter arrived in my mailbox, hand-addressed in a script I hadn't seen in years. Alan. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it. Rosalind. I'm writing from Denver. It's snowing. It's quiet here, but maybe that's what I needed, quiet without you in it. I've joined a men's group. I've started therapy. For the first time, I'm saying things aloud that I've hidden even from myself. I wanted to thank you for the years. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you've found your peace. I saw your interview. You looked free. I'm sorry for all the ways I made you disappear. Alan. No return address. No ask. Just a benediction. I folded the letter and placed it in my fireplace. Not out of anger, out of ceremony. As the flames consumed it, I whispered something only I needed to hear. I forgive you. But I remember. Later that week, I visited the retreat center where the second self now held monthly sessions. A new woman April had joined. Late 40s, quiet, elegant, sharp eyes that rarely blinked. Her story. Married to a pastor. 20 years. 3 children. A life so polished you could cut yourself on it. She spoke barely above a whisper. I found out he had a partner. A man. For 15 years. I didn't flinch. I said, "You're not alone." And her eyes filled. That evening we sat in the library and she asked, "How did you stop the voice in your head that said it was your fault?" I thought of Thomas. Of Alan. Of the version of me who folded napkins while her husband hid behind her smile. I didn't stop the voice, I told her. I gave it a new script. She nodded slowly, took her pen, and wrote something down. The next morning she handed me a note. It said, "You showed me what survival looks like in pearls." That made me laugh and cry at the same time. When I returned to the beach house that evening, I sat in my reading chair with a fresh journal and wrote on the first page. This life I'm building, it began in ruin, but it is mine. And as I closed the book, I realized I was no longer telling the story of my betrayal. I was living the story of my return. Spring didn't knock this time, it simply arrived. The beach turned green again. The gulls returned bickering above the waves. Dandelions popped up between the cracks of the old walkway leading to the porch. Everything was blooming, even me. I received an invitation in early April. A university my old one wanted me to speak at their Women's Week celebration. The same school where I had once taught young women how to stand straight, cross their ankles at the right angle, and speak just above a whisper. Now they wanted to hear my story, the unwhispered version. I almost said no. Then I realized I wasn't going to be polite anymore. I was going to be loud in the most graceful way possible. When I arrived on campus, I felt like I had stepped into a memory wearing new skin. The lecture hall smelled of varnished desks and anticipation. Students filled every seat, notebooks, open cameras ready. I stood behind the podium in a navy blue dress and low heels, hair swept back, eyes steady. I used to teach grace, I began, but no one ever taught me how to survive betrayal wrapped in compliments. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Married to a man who never yelled, never cheated, at least not in the way the world measures it. But he wasn't mine. Not really. He was never even his. He was a performance, and I was the curtain behind which he hid. A few gasps, some tears. I continued. We talk a lot about forgiveness, but let's also talk about clarity, about rage, about how it feels to find yourself at 68 and realize you've been the background of someone else's life. That realization broke me, but breaking my loves is not the same as ending. I took my pain and built a lighthouse with it. Now I help others find the shore. When I finished, they stood. Young women, professors, even a few older alumni who had slipped into the back row. Some clapped with tears on their cheeks. Some didn't clap at all. They simply nodded like something had finally been named that they hadn't dared to speak. After the talk, a professor approached me. Her name was Rebecca. Sharp jaw, kind eyes, pregnant belly barely showing beneath a floral dress. She said, "My mother lived your story, but she never got to tell it. Thank you for telling it for her." I hugged her. Later that evening, back at the beach house, I poured myself a glass of red wine and stood at the window watching the sky burn pink. I thought about all the versions of me, the young wife, the poised hostess, the quiet sufferer, The woman who found a letter in a drawer and realized her life was a fiction. And then the woman standing here now, alone, unafraid, unhidden. I whispered to the sea, "You were never his." It answered not with words, but with the steady rhythm of waves. That weekend I hosted another retreat. 22 women, one small bonfire. A shared journal passed between us like communion. At the end of the night, I read them something I had written for myself but had never spoken aloud. You may not get an apology. You may not get closure, but you get yourself. And that is not the consolation prize. That is the victory. They wept. I wept. We danced barefoot in the dew. Later, one of the younger women, a 24-year-old named Sienna, whispered, "You're the grandmother I wish I had." I smiled and said, "Then you do." That night, I lay in bed wide awake, heart beating with something warm and vast. Not regret, not revenge, but reverence. For the girl I had been, for the woman I had become, for the quiet empire I was building from the ruins. Summer returned like a gift wrapped in gold and sea breeze. The world outside had moved on elections, headlines, distractions, but mine had grown stiller, fuller, deeper. Not empty, not lonely, just whole. I sat one morning on the porch with my tea reading a letter from a woman in Nebraska. She was 78. Her name was Eleanor. She'd been married for 52 years to a man who on his deathbed confessed to a double life. She wrote, "I forgave him the moment he said it, but not because he asked. I forgave him because I deserved to unchain myself from his secrets. Your story helped me make sense of the silence that used to scream inside me." That sentence made me set the letter down and cry. The good kind. The kind that waters something buried deep inside and finally lets it bloom. That day, I decided to do something I hadn't done in over a decade. I wrote a love letter, but not to Alan, not to Thomas, not to anyone else. To me. Dear Rosalind, you waited too long to be chosen, too long to be seen, but here you are, alive, radiant, uncompromising. You were never too much. You were never too cold. You were never the problem. You were the mirror no one wanted to look into, the room no one dared enter, the truth no one was ready to live beside. Now you walk alone, but alone has never felt more like home. You are the story now. Love, Rosalind. I sealed it in an envelope and placed it in the drawer beside my bed, atop my old journals like a crown placed gently back on the pillow. A few weeks later, I was invited to a dinner celebrating the 10th retreat of the Second Self. We had grown to 6 chapters, reached thousands of women, and sparked conversations on college campuses, book clubs, and community centers. At the dinner, I sat beside Sienna, the young woman who had once called me the grandmother she wished for. She leaned in and whispered, "You changed my life, Roz." I smiled. "You're changing your own." I just lit the match. She clinked her glass against mine and said, "To women who refuse to be alibis anymore." We toasted. The whole room toasted. Later that evening, I walked the shoreline alone. The stars overhead blinked like old secrets finally telling the truth. At the edge of the tide, I picked up a seashell. The same shape, the same texture as the one I'd left Alan's ring in years ago. I held it in my palm, not with bitterness, with gratitude. Not because I loved the pain, but because the pain had been honest. Finally. And I had grown from it like ivy up a crumbling wall, uninvited, persistent, beautiful. When I returned home, I lit a candle, opened my journal, and wrote my final sentence for the day. He lived a lie, but I built a life, and I meant every word. There are stories we inherit, and there are stories we choose. For 20 years, I lived inside someone else's script, a well-behaved woman in a well-dressed marriage. I played my part, smiled on cue, and made excuses for the cold that settled between our sheets. I thought that was devotion. I thought that was strength. It wasn't. It was erasure. But here's what I've learned. Betrayal doesn't end you. It reveals you. And silence, though often forced upon us, can become sacred once we choose to speak from it. I didn't burn bridges. I built new ones. Not to him, but to me. And along that path, I met thousands of women who had also disappeared into someone else's shame, only to rise again with their own names on their lips. So if you're watching this and wondering whether you're crazy, whether you imagined it all, Whether your emptiness is somehow your fault? Listen carefully. You are not the lie. You are the awakening. And this is your permission to come home to yourself. Tell me in the comments, what moment woke you up? Who are you becoming now? Share your story below. And don't forget, subscribe to Grace's Truth, where silence ends and power begins.